Cora Merritt had taught 19 children to read in the Arizona Territory, and the morning they came to run her out of town, she rang the school bell one last time, steady, so her hands wouldn't shake. There was a notice folded and nailed to the schoolhouse door. Someone had used a horseshoe nail, the kind a man carries loose in his coat. She did not read it right away. She rang the bell first. Then she took the notice down, smoothed it flat against her apron, and read it in the cold light with her back straight. At the harvest social, only a few weeks later, before 60-odd souls gathered under the lanterns, Prudence Gaddis said it plain. A woman who came here with one trunk and rides off with a gold claim is no teacher. She's a fortune hunter in a schoolmarm's collar. And the room did not defend her. Not one voice. 60 people, and the only sound was a fiddle scraping to a stop and the pop of a lantern wick. There was a letter. It sat in her Bible, unopened, the fourth in 2 years, written in a strong man's hand. She could have ended the whole thing that night with a single reply. One page. One name. She chose not to write it. If your good name was ever ruined by people who never once asked who you truly were, this story is for you. I'm going to tell you all of it, the way it happened, in a little town called Ruby Fork. But before I do, if you believe a person ought to be measured by what they've done, and not by what a neighbor decided to say about them, subscribe and stay with me to the end. And comment the town you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far Cora's name travels, because it traveled further than anyone in Ruby Fork ever expected. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. She came to Ruby Fork 3 years before any of this, on a freight wagon, in the spring, with one trunk and a carpet bag and a Bible. That was all. The trunk was scarred at one corner, where it had ridden 100 rough miles. She stepped down into the mud of the main street in a plain gray dress, and the men loading flour outside the mercantile stopped to look, the way men in a small town look at anything new. She did not look back at them. She asked the way to the church, and she went. There was no school in Ruby Fork then. There was a town, of a kind. There was Horace Gaddis and his bank, a squat brick building with an iron door. There was the Gaddis Ranch out past the mesa, the biggest spread in the valley. There was a mercantile, a livery, 2 saloons, a church that shared its walls with the meeting hall, and a scatter of miners' cabins up the draw. And there were children. Dozens of them. Ranch children, miners' children, the children of men too busy digging and driving cattle to teach their own to read a word. Cora Merritt looked at those children running wild in the street, brown as saddle leather, sharp as tacks, and ignorant as fence posts, and she went to Elder Price, the chairman of what passed for a town board, and she asked for a room. They gave her the old assay shack. It leaned. The roof let rain through in 3 places. She swept it out herself, chinked the walls with mud and rag, and begged a stove off the liveryman that smoked so bad the first winter she taught in her coat. She bought a brass handbell with her own money, a small thing, no bigger than a pear, with a worn wooden handle. And each dawn she stood on the step and rang it, and the children came, 19 of them, at the most. The rancher's boy, who could rope before he could spell. The Halloran twins, whose father worked the deep shaft at the Copper Queen. The Peterson girls. And Tom's Reyes, 9 years old, the poorest child in the valley, whose mother took in washing, and whose father was gone. Tom's came to her that first winter with no shoes. She never said a word about it. She only saw to it, quiet, that a pair of boots turned up by the stove one Monday, and she never once let on where they came from. She boarded plainly, in a back room at the widow Halloran's, and she paid her way. She mended her own boots with an awl and waxed thread, sitting up by a candle. She wore the same 3 dresses turn and turn about, and she kept them clean. She signed the school register every quarter in a small, even hand, C. Merritt, and drew her small salary and asked for nothing more. And the town loved her. I want you to understand that, because of what comes after. In 3 years that woman took the wild get of a rough valley and taught them their letters and their sums and their scripture, and the mothers blessed her name, and the fathers touched their hats to her in the street, and the children would have walked through fire for Miss Cora. When the Halloran twins came down with the measles, she sat up with them. When old drought years dried the creek and the miners' families went hungry, she taught on an empty stomach and shared what little she had. There was one thing about her nobody could quite place. She never spoke of where she came from. Not once in 3 years. A woman will let slip a hometown, a mother's cooking, a church she was raised in. Cora let slip nothing. When someone asked, she smiled and turned the question, gentle as you please, and asked after their own people instead, and they went away feeling they'd had a fine talk and never noticing they'd learned not one thing about her. She kept a Bible by her bed, and in that Bible, tucked between the leaves at the Book of Ruth, she kept a letter. It was worn soft at the folds from handling. It had never been opened. The wax seal was whole. It was written in a strong, square hand, and it was addressed to a name that was not Merritt. She turned it over in her hands some nights and set it back, unread. That is all I'll say of it for now. Remember it. There was an old man boarded near the school. Silas Thorne, a prospector, gone gray and bent, who'd spent 40 years chasing color across 3 territories and had a played-out claim up on the mesa to show for it, a spring and a cabin and a hole in the ground called the Blue Rock. Nobody paid Silas Thorne much mind. He was poor, and he coughed, and he talked to himself. And the general opinion was that his mind was going the way of his lungs. But Cora read to him. That was the whole of it. When his eyes went bad and his chest got worse and he could no longer make out the print himself, Cora Merritt walked up the draw 2 evenings a week and read to a dying old man. The Psalms, mostly, sometimes the newspaper when one came through. She read to him because no one else would, and because a man ought not die in the dark, with no voice but his own. She asked nothing of him. She'd have been ashamed to. He was the poorest kind of poor, and she read to him for the plain reason that it was a kindness and it cost her only her evenings. Silas Thorne died in the winter of the 3rd year, in his cabin, with Cora reading the 23rd Psalm and holding his hand. And that, dear listener, that plain and simple kindness is the exact thing they would use to try to destroy her, because Silas Thorne left a will. They read it at the land office a week after they buried him, Elder Price and the land clerk, a young fellow named Abbott, and a handful of the curious. It was short. Silas had scratched it out himself and had it witnessed proper. And it left his cabin and his 1/3 interest in the Blue Rock claim and all the rights that ran with it to Miss Cora Merritt for reading to a dying man when no one else in this town would trouble to. The room went quiet. Then it went to whispering. Cora was not there. She was teaching. She learned of it that afternoon when she came to the mercantile for a spool of thread, and Prudence Gaddis, who was standing at the counter in her good bonnet, turned and looked at her the way you'd look at something on your boot, and gathered her skirts, and walked out. Did not speak. Did not nod. Cut her dead in front of the storekeeper and 2 other women, and let the door bang. Cora stood there, with her spool of thread. The storekeeper wouldn't meet her eye. She paid her nickel and went home. She did not yet understand what had happened. She thought, perhaps, she had given some offense she didn't know of. She went home to the widow Halloran's back room, and she sat on the edge of her bed, and she took the Bible into her lap, and she turned to the Book of Ruth, and she took out the letter. She held it a long while in the last of the daylight. Her thumb moved over the whole wax seal, over the strong square hand that had written her name, her real name, on the front. One reply. That was all it would take, and she knew it even then. Before the worst of it, some part of her knew a storm was coming and knew exactly how to stop it. She held the letter until the light was gone. Then she put it back, unread, between the pages of Ruth. And she went to sleep. Here is what Cora did not understand yet, and what Prudence Gaddis and Horace Gaddis understood very well. The Blue Rock claim was not about gold. There was no gold. Silas Thorne had chased color up there for a decade and found not enough to fill a tooth. What the Blue Rock had was a spring. A cold, clean, year-round spring, high on the mesa, that ran even in the drought years when the creek in the valley shrank to a string of mud holes. It was the only reliable water on the whole of the high ground. And the mineral rights, the water rights, the whole title to that spring, sat now with a 1/3 share belonging to a schoolteacher who mended her own boots. The Gaddis ranch adjoined that mesa. The Gaddis cattle needed that water. Prudence Gaddis had wanted the Blue Rock Spring for years, and her husband Horace had a quieter, colder way of wanting it. Horace Gaddis, the banker, held a note against Silas Thorne's estate. $1,900 at interest secured against the old man's property. He had loaned it out years back, in dribs, against a dying man's land, and he had waited, patient as a spider, for the old man to die so he could foreclose and take the claim clean and legal. And now, a dead man's whim had put a stranger between Horace Gaddis and the water he'd been waiting years to seize. You understand it now, even if Cora did not. She had not walked away with a gold claim, whatever the town would soon be saying. She had been handed a fight she never asked for, against the richest man and the loudest woman in the county, and she did not even know yet that the fight had started. She found out soon enough. It began with a petition. Prudence Gaddis carried it herself, door to door, in her good bonnet, a sheet of paper and a fountain pen, and she called it a matter of the children's welfare. Unfit influence, the petition said. It said that a woman who would work on a lonely old man for his property was not a fit person to shape young minds. It did not say it in so many words, Prudence was too careful for that, but everyone who signed it knew exactly what it meant, and most of them signed. Not all. The widow Halloran wouldn't. Tom's Reyes's mother wouldn't, and she couldn't even read the thing. She just knew the woman who'd put boots by her boy's cold feet, and she folded her arms and shook her head. But enough signed. In a town it does not take everyone. It only takes enough, and the fear of being the one who didn't. The children started to disappear from the school. A ranch family kept theirs home. Then the Petersons. Then the family up the draw. Cora would ring the bell at dawn on the step, the brass handbell, steady, and count the heads that came, and each week there were fewer. 19 became 14. 14 became 10. 10 became 7. And one morning there was a note nailed to the door. Horseshoe nail, folded paper. It said, in a hand that pressed so hard it tore the sheet, "Go back where the money is." Cora took it down. She read it. She folded it into her apron pocket, and she went inside, and she taught the 7 children who had come as though her heart were not breaking, which it was. She taught them the whole day through. And it was that afternoon, when the others had gone, that little Tom's Reyes stayed behind, scuffing his boot on the floor, and said, "My ma'am says I don't have to stop coming, even if they all stop. She says I can stay." And Cora Merritt, who had not wept over the petition or the empty benches or the note on the door, had to turn to the window a moment before she could answer him. "Then you'd best learn your 9s, she said, when she could speak. "A man who knows his 9s can't be cheated at market." And the boy grinned and stayed. Remember Tom's. He matters more than anyone in Ruby Fork yet knows. That was the small of it. The private cuts. The petition and the empty benches and the note on the door. Cora bore all of it standing up, and I think some part of the Gaddises knew that the quiet cruelties weren't going to be enough, that this was a woman who could take a great deal without breaking, and that if they wanted her gone they would have to break her in public. So they did it in public, at the Harvest Social. The Harvest Social in Ruby Fork was the event of the year. The whole valley came in, They cleared the meeting hall and hung the lanterns and laid the long tables, and there was a fiddle and a caller and cider and pies judged, and the children ran underfoot, and for one night the hard valley let itself be soft. Cora came. She almost didn't, but she thought, and this was her pride, and it was her strength and nearly her ruin both, she thought, I have done nothing wrong, and a woman who has done nothing wrong does not hide in her room. So she put on the best of her 3 dresses, and she brushed it, and she went, and she carried a cup of cider, and stood near the wall, and watched the children she'd taught dance with their mothers. Prudence Gaddis chose her moment. She waited until the fiddle stopped between reels, until the room was full and warm and quiet with people catching their breath. And then she stepped up onto the low platform where the caller stood, in her good bonnet and her Sunday silk, and she raised her voice so it carried to every corner. Neighbors, she said, before we go on with the dancing, there is a thing that ought to be said out loud, in front of everyone, because it concerns every child in this valley. And she said it. She stood before 60-odd souls, the mothers Cora had comforted, the fathers who'd touched their hats to her, the children she'd taught their letters, and she laid it all out. How a stranger had come to town with one trunk. How she'd worked her way into a poor, sick, feeble old man's good graces. How she'd read to him, oh yes, read to him, twice a week, alone, up at his cabin, where no one could see, and how that dying old man, out of his right mind at the end, had signed over to her the most valuable water in the county. And then she said the line the whole valley would repeat for months. A woman who came here with one trunk and rides off with a gold claim is no teacher. She's a fortune hunter in a schoolmarm's collar. And she produced a paper. Waved it. Said it was proof that the schoolteacher had worked on old Thorne, that she'd known what she was doing, that it was a scheme from the start. What was on the paper hardly mattered. It was the waving of it that did the work. Now here is the thing I want you to sit with. In that room were 60 people who owed Cora Merritt something. Their children's reading, a night sat up in fever, a kindness in a hard season. 60 people who, in their own hearts, in their own kitchens, knew the woman by the wall was no fortune hunter. And when Prudence Gaddis finished, and the room hung there waiting, not one of them stood up. Not one said, "That isn't the woman I know." The widow Halloran looked at her lap. The men studied their boots. Tom's Reyes's mother wasn't there. The poor weren't asked to the front tables. And the silence stretched out and became its own kind of verdict, because a lie unanswered in a full room curdles into truth. They waited for Cora to weep, or to shout, to defend herself, to name Prudence a liar, to make the scene that would let them all say afterward, "Well, you saw how she carried on." Cora did not weep. She did not shout. She stood at the wall with her cup of cider and let the whole thing wash over her, and her face stayed still. Then she stepped forward. The room tightened, and she set her cup down, gentle, on the corner of the long table. She turned to the widow Halloran, who was hosting, and she said, quietly, but clear enough for those near to hear, "Thank you for having me. It was a lovely table." And she gathered her shawl, and she walked the length of that silent room, past all 60 of them, with her back straight and her chin level, and she went out the door into the dark. She did not run. You could hear her steps, even and unhurried, all the way across the floor. And then the door, closing soft. And then nothing. The debt was public now. Whatever the Gaddises had done in private, this was different. 60 witnesses had watched a woman branded a thief and had said nothing, and every one of them carried a little coal of shame out of that hall, and shame in a small town has a way of turning to anger at the person who made you feel it. Which is to say, after the social, it got worse. Elder Price convened the school board, 3 men in the back room of the church, and Price at the head of the table looking as grave and righteous as he knew how. Price was not a wicked man. I want to be fair to him, because his kind does more harm than the wicked. He was a weak man who wanted very badly to be seen as a good one, and he had mistaken the loudest voice in the valley for the moral one, and so he did what Prudence wished while telling himself he did it for the children. The board would move to dismiss Miss Merritt from her post, for the good of the school, pending inquiry. And Horace Gaddis moved at the same time, quiet and legal, the way he did everything. He filed a formal challenge to Silas Thorne's will on the grounds of undue influence, that the old man had been feeble and imposed upon. And he petitioned the Territory to freeze the Blue Rock claim, all rights, pending the challenge, so that not a drop of that water could change hands until the courts had spoken. And he called in his note, $1,900 against the estate, due and payable, which the estate could not pay, which meant that if the will fell, the claim came to Horace by foreclosure, clean and legal, exactly as he had planned it from the start. They gave Cora 11 days to vacate the schoolhouse. 11 days. The clerk, young Abbott, brought her the paper himself, and he was ashamed to do it, she could see. But he did it. 11 days to be out of the assay shack she'd swept and chinked and warmed with her own hands, out of the only place in 3 years she had truly made her own. And here, dear listener, is where the story turns. Not in the courtroom, that comes later, and it is worth the wait, I promise you. It turns here, in a back room at the Widow Halloran's, in the lamplight, with a woman and a letter. Because Cora Merritt had a way out. She'd had it the whole time. It sat in her Bible at the Book of Ruth. That letter, the 4th in 2 years, the strong square hand, the name that was not Merritt, was from her father, and her father was Nathaniel Vance. Judge Nathaniel Vance, of the 2nd Judicial District of the Territory. A man whose name, spoken in any land office or courtroom or bank from one end of the territory to the other, would make a Horace Gaddis go pale and a Prudence Gaddis swallow her tongue. Cora Vance had come to Ruby Fork 3 years ago and taught under her mother's maiden name, Merritt, for one reason. She wanted to be known for what she was, not for whose daughter she was. All her life she had watched people bow to her father's name, defer to it, fear it, do her small kindnesses on the strength of it. She had never once known whether a smile was for her or for the judge. So she had gone as far from that name as a wagon would carry her, into a rough valley where no one had heard of Nathaniel Vance, and she had built a whole life on nothing but her own 2 hands and her own good work. And it had worked. For 3 years, every soul in Ruby Fork who loved her had loved Cora Merritt, the woman, and not the judge's girl. That was the dearest thing she owned. It was worth more to her than the water on the mesa, worth more than her post, worth, God help her, nearly more than her good name. Her father had not stopped writing. 4 letters in 2 years, unanswered. He respected her wish. She had asked him, when she left, to let her go and prove herself, and he was a man who kept his word even when it cost him, but he could not stop reaching. And she had never opened a single one, because she knew that if she read even one word in that strong hand, she would want to run home to it, and running home was the one thing she would not do. So on the night the 11-day notice came, she sat with the Bible in her lap, and she took the letter out, and this time she thought about it in earnest. One reply. Father, I need you. That was all. She could see how it would go. A letter down to the district, a wire, maybe, and within the week a rider would come up the valley with the judge's seal, and Horace Gaddis's note would evaporate, and Prudence's petition would blow away like ash, and Elder Price would fall over himself apologizing, and the whole rotten thing would be finished. She had that power in her 2 hands. She had had it all along. She found a sheet of paper. She trimmed a pen. She wrote, Father. And then she stopped, because she saw, clear as the lamp in front of her, what it would mean. If she won this way, if the Gaddises fell not because she was innocent, but because she was the judge's daughter, then everything she had built in Ruby Fork was a lie. She would not have been vindicated. She would have been rescued. And every soul in that valley would learn, in the same breath, that the schoolteacher they'd wronged had been a rich and powerful man's daughter the whole time, and they would not think, we misjudged a good woman. They would think, we were fools not to know who she was. They would fear the name. They would never again see her. She'd have proved nothing except that she'd had a card up her sleeve, and she'd have spent it. If she was only safe because of whose daughter she was, then she had never truly been a teacher at all. She had never truly been anything of her own. She sat a long time over the half-written page, Father, and nothing after it. The lamp burned down. And then Cora Vance took that sheet of paper, and she held it to the chimney of the lamp, and she watched the flame take her father's name off the top of it, and curl it black, and let it drop, still glowing, into the cold stove. And she put the sealed, unopened letter back into the Bible, at the book of Ruth. And she made herself a promise in the dark. She would win this thing, or she would lose it, as Cora Merritt. On her own merit, on the truth. She would not spend the name, not to save her post, not to save the water, not to save her good standing before 60 people who'd watched her walk out into the dark. If they were going to know her at all, they were going to know her for what she'd actually done, and not one thing more. It was, I think, the bravest and the most foolish thing she ever did. It very nearly destroyed her. Wait until you see how close. Because pride, even righteous pride, has a price, and Cora was about to pay every cent of it before she saw a nickel back. She had 11 days and no lawyer and no friends with power, and a woman in the Territory in 1874 could not vote, could not easily hold a claim against a banker's challenge, could not do much of anything against the settled will of the men who ran a town. What she had was 7 children, a brass handbell, and whatever the truth was worth. She got up the next morning before dawn, the way she had for 3 years, and she walked to the leaning schoolhouse, and she stood on the step in the gray light, and she rang the bell. And she began, quietly, to fight. She did not go to her father. She went, instead, to a wooden box under her bed, and she took out a thing she had signed and forgotten 3 years before, and never once thought she'd need, and when she read it through by lamplight that night, word by careful word, her hands began, for the first time since the notice on the door, to shake. Not with fear. With the first cold, rising taste of a chance. The document was her own contract. She had signed it 3 years back, on her first day, in a hurry, glad of the work. She had never read the small print. Nobody does. But she read it now, by lamplight, and she read it again, and the third time through her hands went still. The board could dismiss her, that was true. But not on a petition. Not on a whisper. The contract said cause proven, and a hearing, public, with the accused present and permitted to answer. The men of Ruby Fork had written that clause themselves, years before Cora ever came, to protect their own from a rival's grudge. They had forgotten it. She had not. She took a clean sheet of paper, not the burned kind, not the letter to her father, a plain sheet, for a plain purpose. And she wrote a formal answer to the school board of Ruby Fork in a steady round hand, and she demanded the hearing the town's own rules had promised her. She signed it C. Merritt. She walked it to Elder Price's door herself the next morning, before the bell, and she put it in his hand and watched him read it. His mouth worked. He had expected her to pack. He had expected tears, or flight, or silence. He had not expected the town's own bylaw handed back to him like a lit match. "You can't fight this," he said. "I'm not fighting it," Cora said. "I'm asking you to prove it. In front of everyone. That's all your own paper asks." She turned and went to the schoolhouse and rang the bell. 7 children came. 7 out of 19. The room was cold and loud with its own emptiness. But she taught them their letters as if the desks were full, because that was the work, and the work did not care how many watched it done. Tom's Reyes sat in the front. Close, the way a boy sits when he has decided something and won't be talked out of it. The days went thin and hard, 11 of them. And in those 11 days, she did not go to her father. She could have. That was the thing that ate at her in the dark. One letter, one line, "I am in trouble. Come," and the man whose name she would not spend would have moved the earth to reach her. She knew it. That was what made the not writing so heavy. It is easy to hold a door shut that no one is pushing. It is a different thing entirely to hold it shut against a hand you love. She started the letter twice more. She burned it twice more, and each time, watching the paper curl and blacken in the lamp chimney, she said the same thing to herself, low, like a hand pressed flat on a wound. If she was only safe because of whose daughter she was, then she had never truly been a teacher at all. She had been a judge's girl, playing at chalk and slate, protected the whole time by a name in a drawer. And that was not who she wanted to be. That was not who those 7 children needed at the front of the room. So she spent those 11 days another way. She walked out to the land office and she sat with the young clerk, Abbott, the one who had nailed her notice up looking sick about it, and she asked him plain questions about dates. When was the will filed? When was the note against Thorne's estate recorded? When was the assay taken? The one Horace Gaddis kept waving about. The one that called the blue rock worthless rock, and no water at all. Abbott went pale, and he told her he could not say, and then he said a little, and then a little more, because a decent man cornered by a decent question generally tells the truth in the end. She walked out to the Reyes place, and she sat at Tom's mother's table, and she did not ask her for anything. She only thanked her for letting the boy stay. Elena Reyes looked at her a long moment and said, in Spanish and then in English so there'd be no mistaking it, that when Tom's burned with fever 4 nights running, it was the schoolteacher who sat up with him, not the banker's wife, not the elder, not one soul from the fine houses. She said she would say that anywhere. She said she would say it under God. Cora wrote nothing down in front of her. But she carried it home like water in cupped hands. And in the middle of those days, the 5th letter came. It was not from her father. Not exactly. It was a public notice, posted at the land office and the mercantile both, printed stiff and official. The circuit court of the 2nd Judicial District of the Territory would sit in Ruby Fork, in the meeting hall, to hear the docket of pending territorial matters. Land claims, contested wills, disputed notes. And at the bottom of the notice, the presiding judge's name, Nathaniel Vance. Cora stood at the mercantile window with the whole street going about its business behind her, and she read that name and the ground tilted under her just slightly, the way a floor does on a boat. Her father was coming. Not because she had called him. Because the law had. He rode a circuit, town to town, twice a year, and this season, the circuit brought him here, to the one town in the territory where his daughter was being run out into the road. He did not know. He could not know. He thought she was somewhere safe, teaching, happy, a woman who had asked for silence and been granted it. She could have written to him then, warned him, prepared him, softened it. She did not. She folded the notice into her Bible, at the Book of Ruth, next to the letter she had never opened, and she went home and graded 7 slates by lamplight. The hearing came before the court did. That was the trap of the calendar, and Horace Gaddis had built it well. The board would meet and dismiss her and settle the will and freeze the claim all in one evening before any circuit judge set foot in town, so that when the law arrived it would find the matter already tidy and done. They held it in the meeting hall, and this time the room was full. 60-odd souls again, the same faces from the harvest social, come to watch the second act of a hanging they'd started weeks before. Elder Price sat at the front table with 2 other board men. Prudence Gaddis sat in the first row with her hands folded like a woman at prayer. Horace stood, because Horace always stood, a banker's habit, looking down at people from a comfortable height. He laid his case out cold and clean. He produced the assay, a paper that swore the Blue Rock was played out, no gold, no worth, and he did not mention water once. Because water was the whole reason, and a man does not name the thing he is stealing. He produced the note. $1,900 against Thorne's estate, and by rights, he said, the claim should come to the bank to settle it, and here was this schoolteacher, this stranger, standing in the way of an honest debt with a will she'd wheedled out of a dying man. And then he produced the drifter. His name was Ezra Toll. He was a thin, gray, blinking man with a bad coat and a worse conscience, and he'd been in the country maybe a month. He took the front of the room, and he swore that he'd known Silas Thorne at the end. That Thorne was addled, wandering, not in his right mind. That he'd seen the schoolteacher come to the old man's cabin of an evening, 2 evenings a week, and read to him, and coax him, and that the will was her doing, whispered into a dying man's ear. The 7 parents in the room began to look at the floor. You could feel it go. That was the terrible part. Cora sat there and felt the room she'd almost held begin to slide, face by face, back toward the easy story, because the easy story cost them nothing, and the truth cost them a banker's goodwill. Elena Reyes sat straight in her seat, and Abbott the clerk sat white in his, but they were 2, and the lie was 60. Elder Price called the vote. The board voted to dismiss Miss Cora Merritt for cause. They voted to endorse the challenge to the will. They ordered the claim frozen and the schoolteacher out of the schoolhouse by week's end. She had lost. Honestly, on her merit. To a lie sworn by a paid man, in front of the same eyes that had watched her walk out into the dark once already. She stood up. She did not weep, and she did not shout. She thanked the board for the hearing their own rules had granted her, and she said, so quiet the back of the room had to lean in, that she hoped they'd remember this evening clearly. Every part of it, because a day might come when they'd want to. Then she walked out. Into the dark. Again, and the next morning, the circuit court rode in. They came up the road from the south in the early light, a small party, dust rising gold behind them, and the whole town turned out, because a circuit court was the biggest thing that happened in a place like Ruby Fork twice a year. The associate justice, the clerk of court, a marshal, and at the head, on a tall bay horse, a big gray-headed man in a black coat with a face like weather off a mountain. Cora was on the schoolhouse step. She had gone there out of habit and out of stubbornness, to ring the bell one more time for whoever would come, and she stood with the brass handbell in her hand as the party came up the square, and she saw him, and he saw her. Judge Nathaniel Vance stopped his horse cold in the middle of the road. He did not speak. He looked at the woman on the leaning schoolhouse step with the bell in her hand, the woman he had written 4 letters to and never once been answered, the daughter he'd told himself was safe somewhere, because his silence had honored her wish. He looked at her plain mended dress and her chapped hands and the empty schoolyard behind her, and whatever he'd imagined for her these 3 years, it had not been this. He got down off the horse. He did not hurry. A judge does not hurry in front of a town. But he crossed to her, and he stood in front of her, close, and he said one word, low, only for her. Cora, and she, who had held the whole thing without a crack for 11 days, who had burned 3 letters and never sent one, felt her eyes go hot and her chin go tight, and she said, "Hello, Father." He looked at the schoolhouse. He looked at the bell. He looked back at the square, at the 60 faces watching, and something settled in him, cold and level, the thing that made him a judge and not just a father. "Court sits at 10. He said. "You'll be there." Court sat at 10 in the meeting hall, and this time the room was fuller than it had ever been, because word had gone around that something was wrong with the schoolteacher and the judge, that he'd stopped his horse for her in the road, and the town wanted to see. The docket was called. Land claims, a water dispute up the valley, and then the matter of the estate of Silas Thorne, deceased, and the contested 1/3 interest in the Blue Rock claim, and the challenge filed thereto by Prudence Gaddis on grounds of undue influence. Horace stood to argue it, comfortable, sure, he had a board's ruling in his pocket already. He began to lay it out for the court just as he had the night before. And Prudence Gaddis, seated in the front, certain her word outweighed any paper in the Territory, could not help herself. When the judge asked, mild, for the nature of the objection to the beneficiary, she rose, and she said it again. Clear, for the record, the line she'd made her name on. She's a fortune hunter in a schoolmarm's collar, Your Honor. A woman who came here with one trunk and rode toward a gold claim. That's all she is, and all she's ever been. The room made a small sound, half agreement, half thrill. She'd said it. She'd said it to the judge's face. Judge Nathaniel Vance set down his gavel. He did not bang it. He set it down, careful, on the table the way a man sets down something he might otherwise throw. "Ma'am," he said, "you've spent 3 years measuring this woman by her trunk." His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "I've spent 26 measuring her by her heart." He let that sit. The room went still, that particular stillness, the kind that comes before the axe and not after. "Cora Vance is my daughter." Nobody breathed. "And the next tongue in this town that names her a thief," said the judge, "will do it under oath, in my court, with a Bible under its hand, and answer to me for every word." The silence that fell then was the same silence that had fallen at the harvest social, when 60 people watched a woman walk out and said nothing. The very same. But it was turned inside out now. Then, it had been the silence of a town too comfortable to defend her. Now, it was the silence of a town realizing, all at once, exactly what it had done, and to whom, and in front of whom. Prudence Gaddis sat down. She did it slowly, like a woman lowering herself into cold water, and she did not say another word for a long time. And here is where Cora Vance did the thing that decides whether a story is only satisfying or whether it is true. Judge Vance, having named her his daughter in open court, immediately took himself off the case. He recused. Right there. He announced to the room that having declared his relation to the beneficiary, he could not and would not rule on any matter touching her interest, and that the district's associate justice would hear the evidence in his stead from that moment forward. He would sit at the back. He would say nothing. He would be a father in a chair, and not 1 inch a judge, in anything that concerned his girl. Because Cora would not be saved by his name. She had burned 3 letters to keep from it. And he understood that now. Understood it the way you understand a thing you should have understood years ago, that his silence had left her undefended. Yes, but it had also left her free to become exactly the woman standing at the front of the room, cleared by nothing but what she'd actually done. He would not rob her of that at the last minute by ruling in her favor from the bench. She would be cleared by law, or not at all. So the associate justice took the gavel, a younger man, plainer, with careful eyes. And the evidence came out, and Cora watched her father sit in the back and hold his hands still in his lap and let it. The clerk, Abbott, was called. And the dates came out, the dates Cora had spent her 11 days gathering, quietly on her own merit, asking plain questions of a decent man. The assay Horace had waved about, the paper that swore the Blue Rock was worthless, dry rock, and no water. Its date did not match the land office ledger. It could not. It had been drawn up after the note was called, not before, and altered, and the land office book, kept in a clerk's honest hand, said so plainly for anyone who bothered to read both. A doctored assay is only good until someone lines it up beside the truth. Cora had lined it up. Weeks ago, alone, the Associate Justice looked at the two papers side by side, and his careful eyes went cold. Then they called Ezra Toll. He took the stand blinking, the bad coat, the worse conscience, and he started in on his story. The addled old man, the coaxing schoolteacher, 2 evenings a week. But it is one thing to swear a lie to a school board that wants to believe it. It is another thing entirely to swear it in a court, with a marshal at the door and a judge's flat gaze on you from the back of the room, when you are a drifter a month in the country with nowhere to run. The Associate Justice asked him one question. Just the one. Mr. Toll, were you present in Silas Thorne's cabin on any single evening you have described? Toll's mouth opened. He looked at Horace. Horace looked at the wall. And a paid witness, when the man who paid him will not even meet his eye, does the arithmetic quick. The sweat came out on Ezra Toll's gray face. He said, "I," and stopped. He said, "the old man," and stopped again. And then the whole thing came apart in him at once, the way a cheap dam goes. All together. "He give me $60, Toll said, and his voice cracked in the middle of it. Gaddis, Horace Gaddis. $60 to say the old man was soft in the head, and the woman worked on him. I never met Thorne. I never set foot in that cabin. I never seen the schoolteacher but the once, in the street. $60, and I'd not eaten in 3 days, and God forgive me, I took it. You could have heard a pin drop on cotton." The marshal moved to Ezra Toll's side. The Associate Justice, very quiet, said the word perjury, and then he said a second thing, about a paid conspiracy to defraud an estate, and Ezra Toll put his face in his bad-coated arms and wept, and nobody in that packed room felt 1 ounce of sorry for him, and yet everybody there understood, in the same breath, that he was the smallest and hungriest of the guilty, and that the real weight sat 1 row back in a good coat. They turned to Horace Gaddis. And the thing that damned Horace Gaddis was that he said nothing. The justice laid it out for the record, cold and full. The note against Thorne's estate. The foreclosure it was built to trigger. The assay doctored to call the claim worthless, so no one would ask why a worthless claim was worth $1,900 and a paid liar to a banker. And under it all, the real thing. The thing nobody had said out loud until now. The spring. The year-round water on the Blue Rock, the only reliable water on that mesa, that fed nothing on the Gaddis spread and everything the Gaddis spread wanted. It had never been about gold. It had been about water, the whole time, and a widow's estate and a dead man's kindness were only the road Horace meant to take to reach it. The justice asked him if he wished to answer. Horace Gaddis stood there with 60 of his neighbors watching, and every door of the trap he'd built standing open around him, and he opened his mouth, and he found there was not one thing he could say that would not make it worse. So he said nothing. He shut his mouth, and he sat down and he stared at the middle distance, and his silence was the loudest confession in the room. And everyone heard it. His bank charter, the justice noted for the record, would go to Territorial review. A banker who forges an assay and buys a witness does not keep the public's money on trust. That was not a ruling on Cora's claim. That was a separate and very cold matter, and it followed Horace Gaddis out of that room and did not let go of him. Which left Prudence. She had sat through all of it. The dates. The recant. Her husband's silence. She had gone from certain to gray over the course of one morning, and when the room's attention finally turned to her, to the woman who had started all of it at a mercantile counter and finished it at a harvest social before 60 souls, she rose, out of pure habit, to speak. To explain. To find some footing. Her father-in-law's court manner was gone. It was Judge Vance, from the back of the room, who spoke the only time he spoke in the whole proceeding, and he spoke not as a judge, because he had given that up, but as a man. "You've said enough, ma'am," he said. For 3 years. Sit down." And Prudence Gaddis sat down, and the room she had commanded, the room that had hung on her word and passed her petition, and pulled its children from a good woman's school on the strength of her certainty, sat with her, and looked at her, and said nothing in her defense, and she learned in that hour exactly what Cora had learned at the social, what it is to stand in a full room and be entirely alone in it. The Associate Justice ruled. The will stood. The undue influence challenge was dismissed as founded on fraud. Cora Vance, teaching as Cora Merritt, was confirmed in her 1/3 interest in the Blue Rock claim, and the freeze was lifted. And the note, the $1,900 note that Horace had built the whole scheme around, was ordered examined by the court for the same fraud that had rotted everything else the man had touched. Then, the board. Elder Price did not get to walk away quiet. The dismissal for cause had been voted on a lie sworn under $60, and a thing built on a lie has to come down in the light where it went up. Price was made to reconvene the board, publicly, in the meeting hall, before the same parents who had sat and studied the floor while Ezra Toll lied. He had to stand at the front table where he'd called the vote to run her out, and he had to call a new vote, and he had to say the words, "Dismissal void, cause disproven," Miss Merritt reinstated, out loud, to her face, in front of every soul who'd watched him do the opposite. He was not a wicked man, Elder Price. That was almost the worst of it. He was only a man who had mistaken the loudest voice in the room for the moral one, and had wanted, more than he'd wanted to be right, to be seen standing on the winning side. He said the words. His face was the color of ash. And the 7 parents who'd kept their children in her school looked at him, and the 12 who'd pulled theirs out looked at their own hands. And Cora Vance stood at the back and watched the account be closed, the whole public account, before the very witnesses who'd opened it. She did not gloat. There is a kind of person who, handed that moment, would have made a meal of it, and she was not that kind, and that was the last proof, if anyone needed one, of what she actually was. She had won, cleared by law, not by blood, on the merit she'd nearly died on the hill of. Every door that had been shut in her face swung open in a single week, and the town that had branded her a gold digger stood in the meeting hall and watched itself be wrong. And then Cora Vance did the thing nobody expected, the thing that turned a victory into something the town of Ruby Fork would tell its children about for 40 years. She kept the Blue Rock claim. It was hers, free and clear, confirmed by the court. The spring. The water. The only reliable water on the mesa, the thing 3 people had lied and forged and paid to steal from her, and she gave it away. She deeded the water rights of the Blue Rock Spring, not to herself, not to her father, not to a bank, to the town of Ruby Fork and its school, in the name of Silas Thorne. The old prospector who'd left it to her for reading to a dying man when no one else would. She made it a public trust. Free water, forever, off the mesa, to every family in the valley, the Gaddis spread included, the same families that had pulled their children out of her school and nailed a note to her door telling her to go back where the money was. She gave them the water they'd tried to take. She asked no apology for it. She required no thanks. She simply signed the deed, in her own name, Cora Vance, plain, and handed it across, and let it be done. The town that branded a gold digger was watered, from that spring on, by the very woman it had tried to run into the road. There is a kind of justice that punishes, and there is a rarer kind that shames a place so gently and so completely that it never quite recovers from the grace of it. Cora chose the second kind. She had the first kind in her hand, court-ordered, and hers by right, and she set it down and chose the other. And the next morning, a Monday, she rang the bell. The whole valley sent its children back. 19 desks filled again, and then more than 19, because families came in now from further out, from places that had heard the story. She taught them their letters as she always had. Steady, plain, every dawn, the brass handbell, and her hands did not shake, because they had nothing left to shake about. A year on, it was spring on the mesa again. There was a proper schoolhouse now. Not the leaning one with the notice-scarred door, a real one, square and true, raised with money from the Blue Rock claim, with glass in the windows and a stove that drew right and a bell mounted by the step. And it was Tom's Reyes who rang it now, 9 years old grown to 10, the poorest boy in the valley once, standing tall on the new step with the brass handbell in both hands, ringing the morning in, while Cora watched from the doorway with a cup of coffee going slowly cold in her hand. Judge Nathaniel Vance came through on his spring circuit, the way he did, town to town. But he came a day early to Ruby Fork, and he stayed a day late, and he sat on the porch of the little house Cora kept near the school, and the two of them sat there in the long gold evening and did not say a great deal. Because they did not need to anymore. There were 4 letters, once, 4 in a strong square hand, over 2 years, unanswered, one of them still sealed in a Bible at the Book of Ruth. She had never opened that 4th one. She did not have to now. He was here. The letters had been a man reaching across a silence toward a daughter, and the daughter had held the silence out of a pride that had nearly ruined her, and had also, in the end, made her. Now the silence was over, answered not by ink but by presence, by a gray-headed man in a porch chair with his boots off and his daughter beside him, and the bell of her school ringing across a valley that drank her water and taught its children in her rooms. He asked her once, quiet, why she never wrote. And she told him the truth, that if she'd been saved because she was his, she'd never have known if she was worth saving on her own. And he was quiet a while, and then he said she was the best judge of merit he'd met in 40 years on the bench, and that she'd proved a case he'd have been proud to lose to. And that was all. That was enough. There is one more thing, and then I'll let you go. That same spring, at the town well in the square, Cora Vance came for water on an ordinary morning, and there at the well was Prudence Gaddis. Older now. Quieter, the Gaddis spread was smaller than it had been. Horace's troubles had cost them, the charter gone to review, the note voided, the good coats fewer. Prudence stood at the well with an empty bucket, and the 2 women were alone in the square in the early light, and there was a moment, a real one, where the old thing could have flared, where a lesser woman would have found 100 cold things worth saying. Cora set down her own bucket. She looked at the woman who had branded her before 60 souls, who had passed the petition and pulled the children, and produced her proof of a fortune hunter in a schoolmarm's collar. And she said, "Good morning, Mrs. Gaddis." That was all, at first. Prudence looked at her, wary, waiting for the blade. Cora nodded at the well. At the water. The Blue Rock water that ran clean and cold and free to every soul in the valley, deeded away in a dead man's name by the woman standing in front of her. "The water's cold and clean," Cora said. "Help yourself." And she picked up her bucket, and she walked back toward the schoolhouse, where a boy who'd once burned with fever 4 nights running stood ringing a brass bell in the morning sun, and she did not look back to see the older woman's face, because she did not need to, and because it was almost time for class. A name you never asked after is a name you never earned the right to ruin. Ruby Fork learned that. It learned it slow, and it learned it hard, and it learned it from a woman who taught its children their letters for 3 years while it whispered behind her back, and who watered its valley for 40 years after. If a good name of yours was ever ruined by people who never once asked who you truly were, I hope you get your morning at the well. And when you do, I hope you're kind enough and strong enough to say what Cora said. Comment the town you're watching from tonight. I'd like to see how far her name has traveled by now.